welcome you all, to all of you who are here this morning with me in a virtual way. And this our second Sunday wherein we're going to have to meet in this virtual way, unfortunately. We're meeting on a day that for believers is the day of the year. Yes, Christmas is important, but Christmas, in granting us an historical anchor for the birth of Jesus, is one thing. But the resurrection of Jesus from the tomb is quite another. And most people look at the resurrection as something that is just a matter of faith. In other words, it's a faith position that we accept without really understanding whether or not this time and space historical event can be said to have actually occurred. Now, for a lot of believers, that settles the issue for them, and I totally respect that position, that a person would say, I believe that Jesus died for my sins, I believe that he rose from the grave, and the Bible expresses that. I'm sufficiently grounded in that expression that I need no other considerations in order to ground that element of what it is to be a follower of Jesus, that element of faith. And I have total respect for that. However, for some, there is the question as to whether or not this thing that has been believed is actually something that can be said to have happened. Now, for me, and I may be speaking personally here just because of the way in which God has allowed me to be wired, for me, I can't rest there. I did it first, but it didn't take very long after I became a follower of Jesus, by that pure faith method that all of us do, that I began to question whether or not what I had believed was sufficient in its historical grounding that I could hold to it for the rest of my life. Well, 37 years later, I'm still holding to it. So the sufficiency is there. One Christian philosopher has said it this way. He has said, for some, the resurrection of Jesus is just something one believes in or not. But for some, there has to be more than that. There has to be a grounding in time and space history. And with all things, when we're dealing with ancient history, one has to expand the understanding of why it is that a certain particular thing in history has occurred in order that that certain particular thing can be said to be most probably true. That's a very difficult thing to do, and it requires more thought than most are willing to put into something like the resurrection of Jesus, or for that matter, most any other thing regarding ancient history, especially ancient history of the importance of the resurrection of Jesus. So, either those people who say that it's all a matter of pure faith, there is background information that grounds that pure faith. It's pure faith, but there is some information that's just being taken as truth that grounds it. So nobody's immune to this ideation of the resurrection of Jesus has to be something that can be said to be most probably true with regard to the historical elements. When we couple that to faith, it changes everything. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to look at one of the primary texts regarding the resurrection. And after all, and I'll say this without any hesitation, there is no Christianity apart from the resurrection. The teachings of Jesus, good though they were, many of them have been incorporated in other traditions throughout history. So the teachings of Jesus either are anchored in something that makes Jesus unique, or they are not. And if they're not, then why be a Christian? That to me is the absolute ground floor here. And Paul grounds all of this in the tiniest of ways, by the slimmest thread, and that is the historical resurrection of Jesus. He says it clearly in the very passage we're going to be reading today. Later on in the passage, he says, If Jesus isn't raised from the dead, then you, and speaking of himself, and I are still in our sins. There is no salvation. So I want to take the time to examine this understanding of the resurrection in a way that my hope is that as you listen and consider these things, that if you're one of those believers perhaps who is marginal in this way, or you're a person who doesn't believe at all, that in some way this understanding of the historicity of this event will change your perspective sufficiently that you then will enter into the orbit of those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. So, with that preamble, let's take a look at our text today. I'll be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'll begin reading with the first verse. So if you want to follow along in a Bible and you find that helpful, please do so. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1. Paul says, I want to make to you clear, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preached to you, that you received and upon which you stand, and by which you are saved, if you hold firmly to the message I preached to you, unless you have believed in vain. For I passed on to you as of first importance what I had also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, and then to all of the apostles. Last of all, as though to one born untimely, he appeared to me also. Now, this text gives us a wealth of information, but I want us to do just a little bit of background in this text. The text stands potently, but there's some background to it. First of all, we think our four Gospels, most scholarship, I'd say 60% of it, is on the side of Mark being the earliest. Now, I disagree with that personally for reasons I can't go into right now. I don't think any of the Gospels were written after 70 AD, regardless of those who think that John was written in the 80s or 90s. I disagree with that as well because, gosh, the Jewish temple was torn to the ground. Surely the Gospels would have mentioned that if they were written after 70. So, Mark, let's just take Mark as the earliest of the Gospels. Mark was supposed to have been written somewhere between 60 and 65 AD. That puts Mark roughly 30 years post-resurrection. Now, some argue that that's a very long time. However, it's really not. And we'll get into why it's not in just a moment. Paul, however, was writing in the late 40s. As he did his mission travels. Paul is accepted in a lot of very high circles of biblical criticism right now because Paul's writings are so early and because the corpus of Paul's writings are generally accepted. At least 7 of the epistles are nearly universally accepted as Paul's actual writings, and 1 Corinthians is one of those. Think about it this way. Paul was in Corinth, we know, around 50 to 51 AD. He writes this letter to Corinth somewhere between 54 and 57. That puts Paul's writings at 25 years post-resurrection. It puts Paul's appearance in Corinth at 20 years post-resurrection. But that's close. I mean, that narrows the gap tremendously between the writings and the resurrection itself. However, it comes even closer than that. Even without moving it any closer, which we're going to do in a moment, 30 years is not very long to remember something of the magnitude of the resurrection of Jesus from the grave. Talk to a Vietnam veteran. I know some. They remember very vividly the Vietnam War and their experiences therein. Why? Because those experiences were very impactful for them. Talk to a World War II veteran, 70 years out, and you're talking to someone for whom those experiences are still very vibrant in their thinking. because they were major experiences. I talked to a World War II veteran who was on Omaha Beach during the Normandy landing. He remembers that very well. And he could talk about vividly his experiences of landing on that beach. Well, if you or I had been a first century disciple of Jesus, seen him crucified, and then only a few days later seen him alive, we would remember that. We would remember that. 1 Corinthians is really earlier in Paul's experience than the actual time at which he writes. Paul was converted, if you go back to Acts chapters 9 and 10, Paul was converted, we think, within months of the crucifixion and resurrection. There were 40 days, Jesus made appearances, Jesus ascended, the preaching started on the temple steps, and Paul immediately started persecuting this way. Now, the time spans in there, people have argued that Paul had never seen Jesus. Don't really know that. That's a speculation. We don't know that at all. I mean, Paul was alive months after the crucifixion. He was a young man. He was persecuting the church within months of the crucifixion and resurrection. He was converted within months of the crucifixion and resurrection. So he was already an adult. The fact is, it's very likely that Paul did see Jesus at some point. As a Pharisee and one who was very concerned to maintain Judaism as he was, Jesus would have been an important character to him even prior to the crucifixion and resurrection. So I'm not so sure that Paul hadn't seen him, but that we can leave that aside for now. What we want to do is take this text and look at it for what it means right now. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is very early. Let me just give you a perspective on this. If someone has a source who writes 150 years post-fact from describing some ancient character or event, historiography grants us to say, well, we've hit historical pay dirt with that close a source. Well, in the Gospels and in Paul, we've got sources that go back to within 2 years at most of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. So we're not dealing with greatly distant sources here. We're dealing with sources that are very close to the events. In this text that we've just read a moment ago, Paul uses what's known as a triple hoti. Hoti is a Greek term that's used to say that or and in Greek context, in the sentence structure. In this case, it's that. That Jesus died on the cross according to our scriptures. That Jesus was buried. That Jesus was raised alive from the grave. Those that's make a connection with this text where Paul is not even taking a breath. He's wanting to convey these facts to us in such a way that they have tremendous impact for us as we read his recounting of the facts. For instance, he says, number one, and by the way, if you are a student of Paul, as you as a follower of Jesus should be, you will notice something about Paul. He never ever talks about Jesus without including the title Messiah, Christ. Never. He never just says Jesus of Nazareth. He always says Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Christ. Very important, because that is a title for a Jewish mind of Paul's caliber of deity. Let's take a look at the facts that Paul communicates to us here in this text. He says, fact one, Jesus died for our sins on the cross. Now that's a fact, and you can go through all kinds of Roman history and see that that fact is corroborated. These are facts which aren't very distant to history at all. The second one is that Jesus was buried. That's a fact of history that most scholarship totally agrees with. The third fact is the contentious one, that he rose again from the grave. Paul then says, fact four, that Jesus appeared to many. He appeared to the disciples, to the women. Paul doesn't mention that, which as a good Pharisee he wouldn't, but he appeared to disciples, he appeared to 500 witnesses, he appeared to James, his brother, Jesus' brother, who did not believe, and he also appeared to Paul. And Paul separates these appearances from the resurrection, which is very interesting to me. Paul is trying his best to convey these historical facts as just that, historical facts. Now, Paul says he's preaching and passing on what he was given. When was he given this? Well, if we go to Galatians chapter 1, we find that Paul has a visitation with James and Peter. And this visitation takes place within just a year or two of the crucifixion, resurrection, and conversion of Paul. Says he spent 15 days with them. Well, what was happening during that 15 days? The gospel that Paul was preaching, he says, wasn't added to. Meaning the gospel he was preaching was the same gospel that Peter and James were preaching at the time. He spent that 15 days to become acquainted with Peter and James and the history here. The word is very critical. Paul's Greek is very precise. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 to 19, he says this. He uses a word, historioresi. Historioresi. What does that mean? Historioresi is, what does it sound like to you? It sounds like our word history. Historioresi means a kind of investigative reporting that's going on. So Paul is saying this is not something that Paul just fashioned out of thin air. This is something that Paul experienced, but then he did some investigative work, meeting with Peter and James in order to discover whether or not these things were actually the same as they had experienced. Paul says he got his gospel straight from Jesus, from the Lord. I accept that. However, he didn't leave it there. He went and checked it out. So you've got a 5-point argument here in Paul for the truthfulness of the testimony that Paul gives in that Jesus has come back from the tomb. You've got a literary testimony, that is the creed. This little creed that Paul reads is something that is very ancient and goes right back to the earliest days of the movement, perhaps even when Peter was preaching on the steps of the temple. He then gives a timeline in Galatians chapter 1. He then speaks of the fact of eyewitness testimony, the 500, the disciples, those who saw Jesus alive. He then talks about the apostolic confirmation, and then Paul himself confirms. So you've got this tremendous interlinkage here where if any one of these sources were to collapse, the whole thing would collapse, but none of it collapses. A very early proclamation by these witnesses who all confirm one another. I think that's very significant. Now, some will critique the Gospels, and they will say, look, the Gospels are late. There's a huge expanse of time. We can't trust that something written so far away, 25, 30, 35 years, 40 years away from the resurrection would be reliable regarding the resurrection. However, that's not Paul's problem, you see, because Paul is one converted as a hostile. He was hostile to the gospel. He's converted to the gospel within months of the crucifixion and resurrection, and now he's writing in such a way as to confirm the truthfulness of all of that. So we could set, and I don't mean to be irreverent here at all, we could set the Gospels aside, and if all we had was 1 Corinthians, there would be a strong case for the resurrection of Jesus. Ancient studies, we're talking months, maybe 3 years, ancient studies that could find a source that writes about an event that's only 3 years old in their reckoning. Why, you might as well have been there yourself in terms of ancient history and the study of ancient history. We think nothing of, say, for instance, writers who wrote of Julius Caesar 400 years post facto, and we think we have a good history of Julius Caesar. We think we have a good history of Alexander when there are no writings prior to 350 years after Alexander. Yet we think we know a lot about these people. And you can couple that up with other textual comparisons regarding ancient texts, Thucydides and Euripides and various writers who we have fragments of their writings, but the fragments are 800, 900, 1200, 1300 years from the time at which they wrote to the first copy. With the Bible, we don't have that problem. So we've got a wealth of manuscriptural data that we can draw upon. But I want to focus on 1 Corinthians 15. And I want to focus on it in this way. If we were to take the resurrection and boil it down to some facts that surround it, I think we would find that we've got a really good grounding for believing that these events actually occurred as they're recorded. Here's the one that for me makes a huge difference in the way in which I look at what faith means to me. That commitment that these things are true, and true enough that I can ground my whole life and my destiny upon them. The most solid fact in the New Testament regarding the resurrection of Jesus is this: the disciples truly believed that they had seen Jesus alive. That's a painless statement. The disciples truly believed that they had seen Jesus alive. That doesn't threaten anybody, doesn't threaten the secular mind, doesn't threaten the scientific mind, doesn't threaten anything. It's a very neutral statement. Why is it important to make that statement? Well, first of all, the record gives us to believe that that's absolutely true. However, when we look at it from a human standpoint, think about the people in Waco, or the Branch Davidians. They believed that David Koresh was who he claimed himself to be, so much so that they were willing to die for that belief, and they did, many of them. Those who believed in the Heaven's Gate cult, that the Hale-Bopp comet concealed a spacecraft that was going to come and take them all away to a utopian existence, they believed that sufficiently that they would die. A Muslim bomber who straps explosives to his or her chest and goes into a building and blows herself up along with a lot of other people really believes that they are going to be translated straight away to paradise. The disciples were willing to face the same death that Jesus faced because they really believed that they had seen him raised from the grave. Now, you may say, well, gosh, Rip, people die for things like that all the time. They do. But stop and consider something for just a moment. I'm a contemporary of, say, for instance, the Bigfoot controversy. I've been fascinated by it all my life. I remember going to see a movie when I was a child that scared me to death. I wouldn't look out a window after dark. I was so afraid that Bigfoot's face would be in the window like it was in the movie, which startled everybody in the movie theater. I don't really believe there is a Bigfoot. I'm open to the chance that there might be, but I really don't believe there is. I would think that somebody would have provided a skeleton by now. Well, if I did believe in Bigfoot, I wouldn't be willing to go to my death to support that belief. Well, the disciples of Jesus were more than willing, and throughout history we see people more than willing to go to their death merely for the claim that Jesus came back from the tomb. That is very significant. You know why? Because a liar is not a good martyr. In other words, if these Jewish boys and girls had made this up, if Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John had made the story up, if Paul were making all of this up, there is no way that they would be willing to face what they faced for something they knew to be a lie. Now that, to me, is very significant. When we analyze what it means to believe something and what it means to believe something sufficiently that one is willing to face the same death of the person whom they're believing in, it really means something. Think about it this way. First of all, there's no Jewish predisposition to this. When Jesus was crucified, that in the Jewish mind eliminated Jesus as Messiah. Just like that. The reason is the Jewish Messiah could not be crucified as a criminal in this totally humiliating way for the Jewish mind. Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. So in this context of Judaism, which is so important to the understanding of the gospel, that it's a Jewish understanding, in this Jewishness, there is no way that Jesus could have been the Messiah and crucified on the cross at the same time. What changed these Jewish boys and girls' minds? These Jewish boys especially were steeped in the Tanakh, steeped in the traditions, and for them, this is why you see in Luke 24, the disciples on the road to Emmaus thinking, we thought that he would be the deliverer, but we were disappointed. Why? Because he was crucified on a cross. So that eliminated, the Jewish mindset was then fixed that this couldn't be the Messiah. Jesus could not be the Messiah. It disqualified him altogether. And then keep in mind, all of this happens in Jerusalem. This doesn't happen out in Galatia or some far-flung corner of the empire. It happens in Jerusalem, the center of Jewish thought, the center of Jewish connection. All of that Jewishness, you couldn't get more Jewish than Jerusalem. And that's where Jesus was seen by those who were there alive. And then you find people preaching on the temple steps, no less, in Jerusalem, the very place where the Messiah was crucified. Now, when we start putting these facts together, it starts to paint a picture of history that really becomes very difficult to explain away, in terms of the gospel writers just making this up, or in terms of the gospel writers creating myth, or in terms of the gospel writers creating legends. It becomes very difficult because, again, a liar does not make a good martyr. I wouldn't die if I were J.K. Rowling for the truth of the Harry Potter series, and I don't think she would either. They were transformed by what they saw. Peter was standing on the temple steps now, proclaiming Jesus as the crucified Messiah. How does that happen to somebody? And in 40 days it happened. How does that happen? There's no way to get away from the fact that what we've got here is an incredible transformation. We've got the facts that Jesus died, that he was buried, that he was raised from the dead, that people saw him, believed that they had seen him alive, and we've also got the fact of these incredibly transformed lives. I mean, after all, Saul of Tarsus is no lightweight figure here. Saul of Tarsus wanted to do everything in his power to stamp out Christianity. You know why? Because Saul had read Deuteronomy chapter 28. I encourage you to go read that and think, if you can, put on your yarmulke and think in the Jewish mindset of what Deuteronomy 28 means. The first 15 verses or so have to do with all the blessings that will come as long as the Jewish people will remain faithful to Yahweh. The last 2/3 of it have to do with what Yahweh is going to do if they're not faithful. And Paul knows that. And so when he sees Jesus' gospel and the preaching that's taking place, he wants to do everything in his power to stamp it out, because he knows in his Jewish mind, as a good Pharisee of the Pharisees, born to the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day before the law, blameless, he knows that if he doesn't stamp it out, God may judge Israel again. He wants to avoid that. So he thinks he's doing God's work by stamping it out. And then Paul becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. That requires an explanation. Peter requires an explanation. The fact of the movement itself so shortly after the crucifixion requires an explanation. What is the best explanation? What explanation provides the explanatory power and scope to cover all of these facts? James, Jesus' brother, you remember in the Gospels, there was a point at which Jesus' family said, we got to go get this guy. There's something wrong with him. They wanted to pull him back home and say, what's the matter with you? They thought Jesus was crazy, and James did not believe. What could have possibly changed James's mind? As the brother grew up in the household with Jesus, what could have changed James's mind? I can't think of anything much less than seeing Jesus, his brother, alive after the crucifixion. The resurrection is at the center of belief. How do I know that? Because there's no competing story. No competing story whatsoever, anywhere, within the gospel record or within any other record. There is no story that competes with the fact of Jesus coming out of the tomb alive. That's very significant. The fact that all of this takes place in a very localized area in and around Jerusalem is very significant. The fact that the events are recorded early by Paul and then the gospel writers, that's very significant. And things that are close to somebody's heart are going to be checked out very, very thoroughly. Think about a sick child and the connection that sick child has to the parent. And that when doctors come in with their perspective on what's wrong with the sick child clings to the parent. Why? Because it's so important to them. It's the same with the gospel. These people weren't clinging to something that was just a mild story that they had picked up somewhere along the way. They were clinging to something that they themselves had actually seen, heard, and touched. And that is that Jesus had come from the tomb alive. All of the facts argue for just what the scripture says, that God raised Jesus from the dead. And this is, for me at least, one of the most critical features of this. There are many, many, many naturalistic explanations for all of this that circulate in the world today. Lots of them. The swoon theory, that is, Jesus didn't really die. That's what the Muslims believe. He wasn't even crucified on the cross. The swoon theory came around 17th century or so, that Jesus didn't really die, but that he was taken down and he was revived in the cool of the tomb. Well, I can tell you, given the circumstances of medical advancement in the first century, if you had been crucified for several hours, and before that you'd been whipped, and before that you'd been shipped from pillar to post at night with no sleep, no food, no water, nothing of any kind of comfort prior to being whipped to the point nearly of death. A scourging, a Roman scourging, was no toy, no thing to play with. People who were scourged by the Romans, many of them died because of the scourging, even though the scourging wasn't meant to kill them. So Jesus could have died from a dozen things after being nailed to the cross as he was. And let's take the alternative view that some would give, that he was just tied to the cross. Really doesn't matter too much, because in the end, the whipping and then hanging there with all of that time prior would have been sufficient to kill just about anybody. And the text says the Romans stuck the spear in him and he was brought down from the cross dead. They didn't break his legs because he was already dead. So this idea that somehow he could have just been revived by the spices or whatever could have been brought to him in the cool of the tomb. Yeah, let's take that scenario and examine it for a moment. What would it have meant? It would have meant that this person who was beaten and scarred beyond recognition, according to the text, face swollen, beaten, beard pulled out, thorns thrust into his head. We're going to take the nails because Jesus showed the disciples the piercing points. A spear thrust in his side, that somehow on the third day, he's going to come out of that tomb, and anybody who saw him is just going to say, oh, man, we got to find this guy. Let's lay him down somewhere and get him some medical attention. Nobody's going to fall down in front of him and worship him as the risen Lord. And there are lots of other naturalistic explanations. None of them carry the weight sufficient to provide explanatory power and explanatory scope, and they leave many, many, many questions of the facts that I have given to you here today unanswered, like the change in the disciples, the change in Paul, the change in James. Those facts are not explained. There is one theory, however, and I came upon this about a decade ago, that really does explain all of the facts. So I want to give it to you as an alternative here for anybody who's questioning the veracity of the resurrection in your own mind. Maybe you're a person who's not really ready to commit to this, and I understand that. I spent 22 years of my life not ready to commit to it. There is a theory that makes all of this possible. All of the explanations of the facts surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And it's this, that Jesus is an alien from an advanced species somewhere else in the universe, and that he just came here to the earth. Because advanced aliens have the capacity to do all kinds of amazing things, right? We've all seen the movies. And so these advanced aliens, Jesus could be one, and he could be an advanced alien and go through the crucifixion and everything else and rise from the dead and do the miracles and all of that. That's the only explanation beyond the fact of what the Bible says of Jesus is God raised him from the dead. I'll leave it to you all to decide which one of those seems more possible to you. And given the record of the disciples, I'm going to say God raising Jesus from the dead makes a whole lot more sense than Jesus was an alien. I want to reflect on the cross, though, for just a moment, if I could. The facts are all there. I think anybody who's fair-minded, who looks at these facts and thinks about them carefully, cannot but come away with the notion of, as one of C.S. Lewis's compatriots at Cambridge said to him, "Rum thing, it looks like this may have actually happened one time." I can't see how anybody can come away without that reflection of saying, this really looks like it happened. But if it happened, what does it mean? Here we are on Resurrection Sunday, electronically, I'm sorry to say, but here we are. And for the believer, in my view, every day is Resurrection Sunday. 364 of them between the Easters. Each one of them being Resurrection Sunday, Resurrection Day for the believer, because we walk supposedly in the resurrection power of Jesus of Nazareth having come back from the tomb. We rest our entire eternity upon the fact of him being crucified for our sins and then rising from the tomb. Because if he didn't rise from the tomb, he falls into the category of all the great sages of history who've said some wonderful things, but we can dismiss them if we like. We don't have to obey them. We don't have to take them as something that is so critical to our lives that we can't escape them. However, with Jesus, it's very different, you see, because if Jesus really came back from the tomb, and you and I who claim to be followers of Jesus, if these things are real, they've got to mean something to us beyond just the mere facts. What do they mean? They express something of God's affection for the human race that, I'll have to say it for myself, completely boggles my mind. I can't wrap my mental arms around what this meant for me, for anybody. It's too big for me to wrap my mental arms around. But I can capture it, I think, at least in some helpful way, in a little story. I was reading a book by E. Stanley Jones. I don't know if you know who he is. He was a Methodist who was a missionary to India for a long time. And if you're a missionary to a particular country, once you learn the language and the customs and everything else, you blend in and you begin to develop real friendships. Some of those friendships are with people whom you've not converted. They've not become believers. And E. Stanley was a friend with a government employee, he recounts, who was a young man, young married, just could not accept the cross. He couldn't understand the cross. He liked Jesus as a character. Gandhi liked Jesus as a character. This man liked Jesus in terms of the projection of character that he was given to have in the Gospels, but he could not accept the cross for some reason. He couldn't understand it. It just made no sense to his Indian mind. Well, he and E. Stanley had gone on together as friends for many, many years, and suddenly this young man betrayed his marital vows with his wife. And it started to eat at his conscience. And so he came to E. Stanley as a kind of a counselor and said, "Can you help me with this? Here's what I've done." And E. Stanley, wise, seasoned worker in the field of Christian mission, recognized that he had to deal with this in some way. And so he said, "You really probably should go and talk to your wife about this." And the reason he said that to him is because this man was one of sensitive conscience. He couldn't just live with it. Obviously not. He'd come to E. Stanley for advice as to what to do. Well, He went back to his wife and he confessed the whole thing, the affair that he had had with this other woman over a period of a couple of years, to his wife. His wife had no clue that this was going on. She was completely broken by this. She just collapsed. And for many days, there was no speaking in the household whatsoever between them. The man was very troubled. He just thought, I've done it now. I have ruined everything my marriage was built to be. And then one day his wife came to him and put his arms around this man and said, I forgive you for what you've done. She said, I'm hurt and it crushes me, but I forgive you. I want us to remain together as a married couple. And all of a sudden, all the bells went off in this guy's head. He realized what the cross meant. The cross was love, his love, God's love, for all of humanity, for him, crucified by our sin. That Jesus hung on that cross to make payment for the penalty that we all had to pay before a holy God. And for some reason or another, this experience for this man brought all of that home to him. He knew now that only in forgiveness could there be healing between himself and God, just like the forgiveness had brought the healing between himself and his wife. Now that's an awesome story. That is an awesome story. It touches my heart. It helps me to cognate just the gravity of this day, Resurrection Day. However, the gravity is empty unless it was all true. And so I leave that for you. I think the facts give me great confidence that all of this happened just as the Bible records it. For some, that's going to be more difficult, but I would encourage you to reflect upon these things that we've looked at here today. If you're on the fence and you're thinking, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, can I really be confident in it? Do your homework. And I promise you, just like so many who have done great deals of homework on this very issue for the same reasons they were skeptical, they came away from it, became believers. And I could list off a reel of names of people that would be recognized who have done that very thing. They came into it thinking this can't be so. They went away from it convinced it was so and became followers of Jesus themselves. It's the salvation that he offers. The salvation is that which then pays the penalty for the sin that we've all committed. We've all defied our conscience in some way. And we cannot retract it. We can't fix it. Jesus paid the penalty for all of that on the cross. And God offers that salvation to anyone who will come, who will believe that Jesus died for their sins on the cross, that he was raised from the dead, and will confess that with their mouth. God will hear that prayer. And I promise you, if you want to know what that salvation is for you, he will hear your prayer too. I want to thank you all so much for your attention. I would like to just close, if I could, in a brief word of prayer. So if you're there and this is important to you, would you pray with me, please? Lord, the gospel, the truth of the resurrection, the truth of who you are and what you've done is distant to many of us. It's distant to me, Lord. You know me. And yet, Lord, I've rested my entire eternity in what you did on the cross. I pray, Father, if there's anyone who's listened to this, who's questioning, maybe there's someone who is a believer who's questioning and just is needing an anchor, that somehow, Lord, these words today and these facts have provided that anchor for them. If there's a person, Lord, who's listening who doesn't believe, that they then, Lord, would become followers because they do now believe. I pray all of this, Lord, knowing that there's nothing in me and nothing in what I can say that's going to change anybody's life. But I pray, Father, that you'd couple all these words and these facts and these texts up with your own power, and that you would, through that, bring people to yourself and comfort those who need comforting and make uncomfortable those who need to be made uncomfortable. I thank you so much, Lord, for this time together. And I want to thank you all for taking the time out to view this today. Even though this is rather detached and distant, I apologize for that. I hope that we'll be together soon. Thank you so much for your attention.